The air in Pripyat on the morning of April 26, 1986, was fresh. Spring had arrived in this model Soviet city. Trees lining the avenues were budding, their leaves a vibrant, hopeful green. Children's laughter echoed from playgrounds, a familiar sound in a city proud of its youth. Families strolled along Lenin Avenue, perhaps discussing plans for the upcoming May Day celebrations. They were oblivious, utterly oblivious to the invisible currents stirring just a few kilometers away. Life felt secure, predictable. The massive 6 Lenin Chernobyl atomic energy station nearby was a source of pride, a symbol of Soviet technological might. It promised a bright future, powered by the atom. Apartment blocks, modern and uniform, housed the plant workers and their families. Pripyat was a city built for them. It offered comforts rare in other parts of the Soviet Union, well-stocked shops, good schools, a palace of culture, a sports complex. It was a reward for their vital work. This Saturday morning, many were still asleep, unaware that their world was about to fracture. Others were already awake, preparing breakfast, getting ready for a day off. Or for some, preparing for their shift at the colossal power plant, a looming presence on the horizon. Always humming, always working. It was a monument to progress, or so they believed. The early shift workers began their journey to the Chernobyl plant. Buses ferried them along the smooth roads, cutting through the pine forests. They carried their lunch pails, their minds on routine tasks. They were engineers, technicians, support staff. Each played a small part in the vast machine that was Chernobyl. They talked of ordinary things, family, the weather, the upcoming football match. There was no sense of impending doom, no premonition. The plant, with its 4 operational RBMK reactors, was a familiar, almost mundane part of their daily existence. It was a place of work, nothing more, nothing less. Inside the sprawling complex, the transition between shifts was underway. The night crew, tired but anticipating rest, would soon hand over to the day team. They were unaware that reactor number 4 was not behaving as expected. It was being subjected to a long-delayed safety test. A test designed to see if, in the event of a power failure, the slowing turbines could generate enough electricity to power the emergency cooling pumps until the diesel generators kicked in. This detail, this technical procedure, was far from the minds of most Pripyat residents. They trusted the experts, they trusted the system. It was a trust soon to be catastrophically betrayed. The control room of reactor number 4 was a hub of hushed activity late on April 25th. The test was scheduled for the afternoon shift, but had been delayed. The Kiev electricity controller had requested the reactor remain at full power longer than planned. This delay introduced complications. A fresh, less experienced crew, led by Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptunov, took over. Toptunov, only 25, had mere months of experience as a senior reactor control engineer. They inherited a reactor in an already unstable state, a state that none of them fully grasped. The pressure to complete the test was immense. It had been pending for years. The procedure required a gradual power reduction, but the reactor power plummeted unexpectedly. It fell far below the level considered safe for the test. This was a critical moment. Regulations demanded a full shutdown. Instead, the operators, under pressure from Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer overseeing the test, attempted to increase power. Dyatlov was a domineering figure, known for his uncompromising insistence on following orders, often his own. He dismissed concerns. He pushed his subordinates. He wanted the test completed, no matter the growing risks. His will overrode caution. To raise the power, operators withdrew an excessive number of control rods from the reactor core, far more than regulations permitted. The RBMK reactor had a dangerous design flaw, a positive void coefficient. At low power, this meant that as water turned to steam, reactivity and thus power could surge uncontrollably. The operators were walking a razor's edge, unaware the cliff was crumbling beneath them. They were fighting the reactor, trying to force it into a condition suitable for the test. They were, in essence, disabling some of its crucial safety systems to achieve their goal. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26th, the test officially began. The steam to the turbines was shut off. The turbines began to coast down. The power to the main coolant pumps decreased as expected. But then, the unexpected happened. The slowing pumps reduced the flow of cooling water through the core. This, combined with the reactor's inherent instability at low power and the excessive withdrawal of control rods, triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. Power began to surge, uncontrollably, exponentially. In seconds, it rocketed to levels the reactor was never designed to handle. The operators watched in dawning horror. The moment of reckoning had arrived. At 1:23 and 40 seconds a.m., Alexander Akimov pressed the AZ5 button. the emergency shutdown switch. It was supposed to be their ultimate safeguard. It should have inserted all control rods fully into the core, halting the nuclear reaction. But the RBMK reactor harbored another fatal flaw: the design of the control rods themselves. As they began to insert, graphite tips on the ends of the rods temporarily displaced water, briefly increasing reactivity in the lower part of the core. In an already surging reactor, this was like pouring gasoline on a fire. It was the final, fatal push. A series of violent explosions ripped through reactor number 4. The first was a steam explosion, caused by the immense pressure buildup. This was followed seconds later by a second, more powerful blast, likely a hydrogen explosion, as superheated steam reacted with zirconium fuel cladding. The 2,000-ton lid of the reactor, the upper biological shield, was blasted off. It landed back into the reactor shaft at an angle, a broken monument. The reactor building was torn apart. A column of incandescent material, radioactive fuel and graphite, shot a kilometer into the night sky. The world had just changed forever. Workers at the plant and residents in nearby Pripyat were jolted awake by the blasts. Some thought it was an earthquake, others a conventional explosion. Valery Kodemchuk, a pump operator, was instantly killed, his body never recovered, entombed within the reactor debris. Vladimir Shashanok, an automatic systems adjuster, was found severely burned and irradiated. He died hours later in the Pripyat hospital. Men in the control room felt the building shake violently. Dust and debris rained down. Alarms shrieked. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into terrifying darkness, broken only by emergency lamps. From the windows of their apartments, Pripyat residents saw a beautiful, terrible sight. A strange, multicolored glow emanated from the direction of the power plant. Some described it as a rainbow or an aurora. It was the light of burning graphite and ionized air, a beacon of unimaginable poison. Unaware of the true nature of the disaster, some curious onlookers even gathered on balconies or rooftops to watch. They did not know they were witnessing the heart of a nuclear reactor exposed to the heavens, spewing deadly radionuclides into the cool spring air. The atom, once a symbol of power, had unleashed its most terrifying fury. The Chernobyl disaster was not a single error, but a confluence of critical failures. At its heart lay the RBMK 1000 reactor design. This Soviet-era reactor was unique, a graphite-moderated, water-cooled channel-type reactor. It was designed to produce both electricity and weapons-grade plutonium, a dual purpose that influenced some of its inherent vulnerabilities. Unlike most Western reactors, it lacked a full containment structure robust enough to withstand the kind of explosions that occurred. This absence would prove catastrophic, allowing radioactive materials to be spewed directly into the atmosphere. It was a design optimized for production, not for ultimate safety. A key design flaw was the positive void coefficient mentioned earlier. In simple terms, if the cooling water turned to steam, creating voids, the nuclear reaction would speed up, not slow down. This created a dangerous feedback loop, especially at low power levels where the reactor was inherently less stable. Operators were not fully aware of the extent of this danger under such conditions. The operational manual reportedly downplayed this characteristic. This flaw made the reactor difficult to control and prone to power surges if not handled with extreme precision and adherence to strict, well-understood safety protocols. The second critical design flaw concerned the control rods. These rods, made of boron carbide, were designed to absorb neutrons and slow down the chain reaction. However, they had graphite tips. When the AZ-5 emergency shutdown was initiated, these graphite tips, as they entered the core, momentarily displaced water and increased reactivity in the lower part of the core. In the specific conditions of April 26th, a reactor already on the brink of a power surge, this design feature had the opposite of its intended effect. It acted as a detonator. This positive scram effect was a hidden trap, unknown to the operators. Compounding these design vulnerabilities were the operational errors. The test was poorly planned and executed. Operators disabled several crucial safety systems to conduct the experiment. They violated operating procedures by running the reactor at a dangerously low power level and withdrawing too many control rods. The pressure to complete the test, combined with the lack of a strong safety culture and inadequate understanding of the reactor's behavior under extreme conditions, created a recipe for disaster. As one scientist later put it, the operators were like pilots attempting a complex maneuver without fully understanding their aircraft's limits in a storm. In the immediate aftermath of the explosions, control room number 4 was a scene of utter chaos and disbelief. The room, once a symbol of technological command, was now filled with dust, smoke, and the stench of burning material. Lights had failed, plunging the operators into a disorienting semi-darkness, punctuated by the frantic flashing of emergency indicators on the control panels. The air thrummed with the terrifying, unfamiliar roar from the destroyed reactor hall. Alexander Akimov, the shift supervisor, and Leonid Toptunov, the young reactor operator, stared at their instruments, their faces pale with shock. The readings were nonsensical, off the charts, or simply dead. Anatoly Dyatlov, who had overseen the ill-fated test, initially refused to believe the reactor was destroyed. He ordered Akimov and Toptunov to manually feed emergency cooling water into the core. Convinced the reactor was still intact and just needed cooling, he shouted, he threatened. He was in denial, unable to comprehend the scale of what had just occurred. Under his relentless pressure, Akimov and Toptunov, along with other operators, made desperate, heroic, but ultimately futile attempts to understand the situation and mitigate the damage. They ventured into heavily damaged parts of the plant, unknowingly exposing themselves to lethal doses of radiation. Communication lines were down, information was scarce and contradictory. Initial reports to plant director Viktor Bryukhanov and subsequently up the chain of command to Moscow drastically underestimated the severity of the accident. Bryukhanov himself, arriving at the plant, could not believe the reactor core was gone. He reported a fire, a hydrogen explosion, but insisted the reactor itself was intact. This early misjudgment, born of shock and an ingrained Soviet culture of avoiding bad news, would have devastating consequences for the response and the delay in evacuation. The truth was too terrible to accept. The operators in control room number 4 and those sent to assess the damage were the first victims. They received massive doses of radiation. Akimov and Toptunov, despite feeling increasingly unwell, stayed at their posts for hours, trying to pump water into what they believed was a damaged but salvageable reactor. They were driven by duty, by a desperate hope to regain control. They did not know they were already dying. As Valery Legasov, a leading Soviet nuclear physicist, later stated, it was like an airplane pilot who had lost all his instruments. All he could do was guess. Their bravery was immense, their sacrifice profound, their situation utterly hopeless. With the reactor core breached and the building in ruins, a new, terrifying threat emerged: the graphite fire. The RBMK reactor contained an enormous amount of graphite, some 1,700 tons, as a neutron moderator. This graphite, now exposed to air and intensely hot from the nuclear fission products, ignited. It began to burn fiercely, sending a plume of smoke and radioactive isotopes high into the atmosphere. This was not a normal fire. It was a fire consuming the very heart of a nuclear reactor, a radioactive inferno that would burn for days, continuously releasing deadly contaminants. The first to respond were the local firefighters from Paramilitary Fire Station No. 2, commanded by Lieutenant Volodymyr Pravik. They arrived within minutes of the alarm, around 1:28 in the morning. They saw flames leaping from the roof of the turbine hall and the reactor building. They knew it was serious, but they had no conception of the invisible radiological danger they were rushing into. They were not equipped with dosimeters that could measure the incredibly high levels of radiation. They were not warned. Their training was for conventional fires, not for battling a blaze in a shattered nuclear reactor. These men ascended the fire escapes and ladders, dragging hoses towards the inferno. They fought the flames on the roof of the turbine hall, preventing it from spreading to reactor number 3. They worked in conditions of extreme heat and choking smoke, unaware that every particle of dust, every wisp of smoke, was saturated with lethal radionuclides. Lieutenant Pravik and his crew, along with another unit led by Viktor Kibanok from Pripyat's fire station number 6, displayed incredible courage. They did their duty, as firefighters always do. They went where they were told, into the heart of the danger. Many of these first responders received fatal doses of radiation within the first hour. They began to feel sick, a metallic taste in the mouth, uncontrollable vomiting, intense weakness. These were the telltale signs of acute radiation syndrome. By dawn, many were already being transported to the Pripyat hospital, their bodies ravaged by an enemy they could not see, smell, or taste. 28 firefighters would die agonizing deaths from radiation exposure in the weeks and months that followed. Their sacrifice, born of ignorance of the true peril, saved the adjacent reactor, but came at an unimaginable personal cost. They were the first heroes and the first martyrs of Chernobyl. In the critical hours and days following the explosion, the Soviet government's response was characterized by secrecy, denial, and delay. The instinct to control information, deeply ingrained in the Soviet system, took precedence over public safety. Mikhail Gorbachev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, was not informed of the accident until several hours after it occurred. Even then, the initial reports reaching Moscow were vague and significantly downplayed the scale of the disaster. Plant Director Bryukhanov reported an accident and a fire, but insisted the reactor core was intact. This misinformation shaped the early, tragically inadequate response. For nearly 2 days, the citizens of Pripyat, living just a few kilometers from the burning reactor, were kept in the dark. While radioactive particles rained down on their city, children played outside. People went about their daily routines. Weddings took place. They saw the smoke, they saw the military vehicles, they heard rumors, but there was no official information, no warnings, no instructions to stay indoors or take iodine tablets. The local authorities, awaiting orders from Moscow, were paralyzed by indecision and a fear of causing panic. This silence was not just negligent, it was deadly. It was only when radiation alarms began sounding at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, over 1,000 kilometers away on the morning of April 28th, that the Soviet Union was forced to acknowledge the accident. The Swedes detected alarming levels of radioactive particles and, tracing their origin, confronted Moscow. Faced with undeniable international evidence, the Soviet government finally made a brief, terse announcement on state television. It spoke of an accident at Chernobyl, stating that measures were being taken and that some people had been injured. It was a masterpiece of understatement, offering no real sense of the catastrophe's magnitude. The decision to evacuate Pripyat was agonizingly slow. Only on the afternoon of April 27th, some 36 hours after the explosion, did the evacuation begin. Buses were hastily assembled. Residents were told to pack only essential belongings, that they would be gone for just a few days. Comrades, due to the accident at the Chernobyl atomic power plant, unfavorable radiation conditions are developing in the city of Pripyat, the announcement blared from loudspeakers. For this reason, a temporary evacuation of the city's residents will take place. For many, this was the first official confirmation that something was terribly wrong. The delay had exposed tens of thousands to dangerous levels of radiation. In the aftermath of the explosion and the initial failed attempts to control the disaster, a massive mobilization began. Hundreds of thousands of people, known as liquidators, were conscripted or volunteered from across the Soviet Union. They were soldiers, miners, engineers, scientists, drivers, construction workers, and medical personnel. Their task was immense and terrifying: to contain the raging nuclear inferno, clean up the radioactive contamination, and build a protective sarcophagus over the destroyed reactor number 4. They were sent into a radioactive wasteland, often with inadequate protective gear and a limited understanding of the extreme risks they faced. The liquidators performed acts of incredible bravery, often under dire circumstances. Firefighters continued to battle blazes. Helicopter pilots flew daring missions over the exposed reactor core, dropping sand, clay, lead, and boron to try and smother the fire and absorb radiation. Miners were brought in to dig a tunnel beneath the reactor to install a cooling system, working in intense heat and radioactive conditions. Soldiers cleared radioactive debris from the roofs of the plant, sometimes with little more than shovels, in brutally short shifts due to the lethal radiation fields. As one liquidator, a helicopter pilot, recalled, "We knew it was dangerous, but it was our duty. Someone had to do it." While the liquidators battled the invisible enemy at Chernobyl, the lives of ordinary citizens were irrevocably shattered. The evacuation of Pripyat on April 27th was just the beginning. Over the following weeks and months, the exclusion zone around the plant was expanded, eventually encompassing a 30-kilometer radius. More than 116,000 people were permanently relocated from their homes in Ukraine and Belarus. They left behind their possessions, their communities, their past lives. The evacuations were often chaotic and traumatic. Families were separated. Pets were abandoned. The psychological toll was immense, a grief for lost homes and an uncertain future. The human cost of the disaster, particularly for the liquidators and the early evacuees, was severe. Thousands suffered from acute radiation sickness. Many of the most heavily exposed, like the first firefighters and plant operators, died within weeks or months. In the longer term, survivors faced increased risks of cancers, particularly thyroid cancer in children, leukemia, and cataracts. The true number of deaths attributable to Chernobyl remains a subject of debate and controversy, with estimates ranging from a few dozen officially acknowledged direct deaths to tens or even hundreds of thousands of premature deaths from radiation-induced illnesses over decades. The price of containing Chernobyl was paid in human lives and shattered health. The Chernobyl disaster left an indelible scar on the landscape, on human health, and on history. The most visible reminder is the exclusion zone, an area of roughly 2,600 square kilometers around the plant, officially uninhabitable. Pripyat, once a vibrant city of nearly 50,000, now stands as a ghost town, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Schools with books still open on desks, amusement park rides rusting in silence, homes filled with the abandoned relics of abruptly ended lives. These eerie, silent towns serve as a stark testament to the destructive power of the atom unleashed and the profound disruption of human existence. The environmental impact was devastating and widespread. Vast tracts of agricultural land and forests in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were contaminated by radioactive fallout. Rivers and lakes were polluted. Livestock had to be slaughtered. The radioactive cloud spread across much of Europe, leading to concerns about food safety and environmental contamination far beyond Soviet borders. While nature has shown resilience in the exclusion zone, with wildlife returning in the absence of humans, the underlying radioactive contamination will persist for centuries, a long-lived legacy of those fateful seconds in April 1986. The soil, the water, the flora, all bear the invisible signature of the catastrophe. Chernobyl had profound consequences for the nuclear power industry worldwide. It exposed critical safety flaws in the Soviet RBMK reactor design and highlighted deficiencies in operational procedures and safety culture. In response, international safety standards were significantly strengthened. There was a renewed focus on reactor design, emergency preparedness, and international cooperation in nuclear safety. The disaster forced a global re-evaluation of the risks associated with nuclear energy, leading to slowdowns in new plant construction in some countries and a greater emphasis on transparency and oversight. The era of unquestioning faith in nuclear technology was over. Perhaps one of the most significant and initially unintended consequences of Chernobyl was its impact on the Soviet Union itself. The government's initial secrecy and attempts to cover up the scale of the disaster severely damaged its credibility, both domestically and internationally. It became a symbol of the failures of the Soviet system. The disaster fueled Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost openness, as the need for transparency became undeniable. Many historians argue that Chernobyl, by exposing the system's deep-seated problems and fostering public discontent, contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The explosion at Reactor 4 sent shockwaves that reached far beyond the radiological, shaking the very foundations of a superpower and altering the course of the 20th century. For more information about what happened, I'm leaving a link in the description so you can read more about it.